So now let me introduce our next speaker, Charles Harrington. Chuck Harrington is Chairman, Chief Executive Officer, and President of Parsons Corporation. They're a global defense, security, industrial, and infrastructure solutions provider. They're headquartered in Pasadena, California. They've got more than 15,000 employees and some $3 billion in revenue. Chuck is an engineering graduate at California Polytech State University in San Luis Obispo. And he has a master's degree in business administration from the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. Chuck is a registered professional mechanical engineer. In addition to his responsibilities at Parsons, Chuck serves on the board of AES Corporation and either serves on or has served on a number of university and nonprofit boards and senior executive roles. In 2015, he was honored by the New York Building Congress with a special industry recognition award. So we are blessed to have him here with us today. So please help me to give a warm round of applause for Chuck Harrington. All set.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, a show of hands, who, if anyone, has heard of Parsons before? What you probably don't know is what we're doing these days. And one of the things that being privately held has allowed us to do is to continually reinvent our corporation. And just as a kind of a background story, I started with the company. I've been with the company now 34 years, so I started right at birth. When I started with the company, our federal government unit, the company was originally called, we were part of a company called Bechtel McCone Parsons. And it's Steve Bechtel, Bechtel Corp., a gentleman named John McCone, and Ralph Parsons. And we formed and originally started making concrete Liberty ships to World War II. And then the government hired Parsons, or Bechtel McCone Parsons, to go through and come up with fair cost estimates of all of the U.S.'s manufacturing plants, and so that the government could buy those and governmentize those to support the war effort. So the entity went through, made all these estimates, then got also to building shipyards at the end of the war down in Louisiana and Mississippi, and also in that effort doing estimates again to allow private industry to buy those plants back. Well, anyway, during that effort, Ralph Parsons, our founder, got into a disagreement with Mr. McCone and decided he was out of there, and so they bought his shares, and he moved to LA and formed Parsons. McCone decided to leave a few months after that, became Secretary of the Navy, and later the first director of the CIA, and then Steve Bechtel formed Bechtel Corporation. So it was an interesting start to our company. But although Ralph always wanted to be an oil and gas guy, what he was able to do first was develop our company in water and federal government work. And Parsons was a very big provider of U.S. missile defense systems. In fact, we provided a lot of the work around the silos and the launch and control centers. We had patents on special technology, that snubbers that kept missiles fixed in their silos. And then we saw the downturn of missile defense. So we predicted the downfall of our government business. But being agile at the time, we immediately moved over on what was called the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. And Parsons really owned that part of the business. The dissolution or melting away, if you will, of the fuel rods that came out of nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers so that the government could reprocess that nuclear waste and make new rods. That was then outlawed during the Carter administration. We again saw our markets going away, and then Parsons got into demilitarizing chemical warheads, taking mustard gas, VX, and other types of units, worked it out on Johnson Atoll with the government, and then the government had another plant going in Colorado, and they had a release, and it killed quite a bit of sheep. And so the process that we were using of incineration was outlawed. So the company took our own money, and we've done this several times, and invested in technology and developed a technology to get what's called 7 nines, or 99 and 5 more nines destruction using supercritical water oxidation process, and we own that technology. And so we then built several plants. We designed, built, operate, then ultimately dismantled and decontaminated these plants. So then we saw chemical demilitarization going away, and we said, now what? And we started trying to do buildings and things that probably many of you in here do, and we found out we don't do those too well, especially military housing. We found that we can either build great housing and lose a lot of money, or not such great housing and have not a good customer. But we need complex things, or we're going to make it complicated. I think that was the lessons we learned with that. So we were looking for something new, and we said, well, let's back to the future. It's a dangerous world. Let's go back into missile systems, back into cybersecurity, back into intelligence services, and we're now one of the largest providers of cybersecurity to the U.S. government, both offensive and defensive skills, intelligence services, and the largest provider of non-hardware services to the Missile Defense Agency. That's part of what we do. We also are in the infrastructure business, mainly large transportation, water, wastewater. And years ago, we saw the confluence of these jobs getting much larger. When I started my career, I remember a $100 million job was just massive. And our largest job today that we're working on, I think, is $18 billion. And the jobs have just gotten so large, and they've gotten so large so fast. Our largest projects today, our 4 largest projects, are all airports. So Abu Dhabi Airport, Dubai Airport, or Doha Airport, and Mexico City are the 3 largest. And these jobs are just massive in scale. And so it takes a company of scale with a large supply chain of specialty entities to help you deliver these kinds of massive programs. And that's one of the things that's really driving our industry that we see. There is a lot of consolidation going on in much larger players, partly because the job size has gotten so big. And then the last thing we do is industrial, and Dave talked about that in his presentation of the various aspects of industrial we work in. So that's Parsons. We're mainly an engineering construction company, but we also run state motor vehicle inspection programs. We had my previous leader, our previous CEO said, if we can make money on it, we'll do it. If we can deliver pizza and make money, we're going to deliver pizza. Well, I think a lot of companies tried those things. What we realized at the end of the day, what we're really, really good at is project management, we think. And we are engineers at our core. So how can we leverage that to maximize our revenues and shareholder wealth? And who our shareholders are has changed pretty dramatically through time. We said we're 15,000 people. We operate in 80 different languages around the world, although we're really not operating in that many countries. We're mainly US and Canada and in the Middle East. Those are our major playgrounds. We will pursue marquee programs like airports anywhere in the world, but mainly we're a US Middle East contractor. And we've been around since the 40s. So organization, I think this is important given, because I'm trying to set up where we're going with this talk about ESOP. We are structured much like you'd see any publicly traded company. And in fact, we were a publicly traded company. We were on the American Stock Exchange through the 70s, moved to the New York Stock Exchange, and then we just had a confluence of events occur that I'll get to a little later on. But because of that public company background, we've always had a public company board. And if you go to our website and look at who our board directors are, you'll see that they're all CEOs, current or former CEOs of Fortune 200, Fortune 300 companies for the most part. And I'm the only internal member on our board, which is currently sitting at 10 members. The typical support groups, and we operate maybe a little differently than a lot of companies. We are very market line driven. So we view our company through the lens of we are infrastructure, industrial, and government services. Any of you who work in federal government work, you know that's a world in and of itself, and even normal finance doesn't apply always to government work. But we have to operate in different regions, especially Canada and the Middle East, where we need to be Canadian and we need to be Qatari or Emirati or Saudi or Omani or Kuwaiti. And so we have large regions. In fact, we have roughly 6,000 employees in the Middle East. But we also do direct hire construction. We have our own construction arm. Often we are in joint venture, and often we are a minority partner. So we might be 35, 45, 49%. So we'll have a couple $2 billion of additional revenue that doesn't run through our books because we're not consolidating that revenue. We get the profits from it, our portion, but not the revenues. And then we have our enterprises unit, which is our unit that does the financing of large P3s. And our latest win in P3s is the Regina Parkway in Canada. It is roughly $1.4 billion bypass around the city of Regina. So it's got several bridges and a roadway. We'll design that, construct that, own and operate that roadway for 30 years, and then it'll turn back over to the city of Regina. We are a company that's driven very strong on core values, and everybody has core values. I've been asked to speak quite a bit around the world on core values because we did do something unique with it. We have our 6 of safety, quality, integrity, diversity, innovation, and sustainability, and we've had these for many, many years. But every core value has a goal. I was an athlete most of my life, so if there's not something to keep track and who's winning and losing, I really don't know how to operate. So we created goals, and then we start measuring each other. Our board measures us. It drives compensation for every senior executive in the corporation. There's about 400. And all of our comp is moderated by these core values. We also spend a fair amount of time with statisticians coming up with leading and lagging indicators. The thing that I've gotten the most interest on is the core value of integrity. How do we measure integrity? And we've put a lot of effort in that. And one of the reasons why Parsons has been picked for 6 years in a row as one of the world's most ethical companies. But this drives who we are as a company. And it goes from our governance structure to our ownership structure and everything else. So the decisions we made when we decided to go ESOP, this had a large part of who we were and how we made that decision. So what happened in 1984? The U.S. tax law changed. And it's important to note U.S. and remembering that we're a little over a third of our companies outside the U.S. But in the U.S., lenders were able to exclude from taxable income 50% of the interest that they earn on loans made to ESOPs. So that allowed banks, lenders, to make more money on ESOP loans. And it's a competitive environment, so they offered some of those savings back to ESOPs and ESOP companies in terms of reduced loan rates. So it gave you a competitive advantage in terms of your capital structure from a loan perspective. Companies were also allowed to deduct from taxes any dividend paid to ESOP participants. So as and you'll see some statistics in a minute, that was pretty important to us because we had a long history of giving dividends. And for us, we were a publicly traded company. Going to an ESOP structure allowed us to keep all the governance of a public company, but not have all of the reporting to shareholders, analysts, and have everybody trying to predict your earnings and all this stuff that goes along with that. So these were all the things that really made ESOPs more attractive. By the way, if you look at that picture, the gentleman standing up there, that was our chairman and CEO at the time, Bill Leonard, great guy, former Air Force general, who was in charge of strategic missile defense. He's actually standing on a box. He was a quite short gentleman. You probably don't recognize the guy on the right who's got a full head of hair, kind of looking up at him in admiration. That's actually a very young Chuck Harrington. That was 1984. I'd been with the company about 2.5 years, and they picked me to go do this photo shoot with Newsweek. So there were other ways that companies could use their ESOPs in ways that were really less drastic than going public. So if you're a company and you have this issue, which we all have at some point, and I'll get into the issues that we see today, you have an accumulation of wealth, maybe you're ending career, or there's several senior leaders, and you're trying to figure out how do you monetize your worth. You can sell to the employees via an ESOP. You can cash out and leave the legacy of the company to the people who've really been driving that company. So the people that have made the company what it is, they can participate in that next round of wealth generation. And it's a lot less drastic than going public. You can also boost your capital. The ESOP can go out and get additional financing. So if you're not overly leveraged, ultimately it's going to come back to the leverage on your balance sheet. But the ESOP can still go out and get debt generally cheaper than we can as a company because of the tax law changes that abound that. ESOP can also borrow money to buy stock and buy stock back, raising stock price for those employees that still have stock. And we did this. My predecessor decided to really aggressively grow our oil and gas unit during a time when, I know this sounds like nobody remembers it, but it wasn't that long ago, late 90s, when the price of oil dropped down to about $7 a barrel. As it turns out strategically, that's not a good time to try to double the size of your oil and gas unit. I think we were working in countries that don't even exist today. It was a very volatile time, if you remember. In fact, we had one job in Venezuela where we had 2,000 employees and the entire nation went on strike. And by Venezuelan law, we had to pay 2,000 employees every day to sit home and play soccer. So we decided to sell the unit. Well, the most efficient way for us to sell the unit was for Parsons to divest the oil and gas unit by selling it to the ESOP. And that's what we did. No longer was Parsons' entity. The employees still owned it, but the company did not. Ultimately, then we created a different ESOP stock specifically for our E&C unit, and ultimately the trustee with a board that we created over it sold that unit to another entity. So it does give a lot of structural flexibility. So at the time, Bill Leonard and the leadership team thought, well, if we went ESOP and made every employee of the company a shareholder, we're going to really increase employee buy-in. At the time, 1984, you may not remember, but that was when the oil and gas was also going down. So cost pressures were big. People were looking to try to save money. We were thinking every employee would take their pencils down to an inch long before they got rid of it. We'd use both sides of calculation sheets and all these things to save money. The employee owners would have a personal stake in the company's success, and ultimately it'd be incentives not only for them to work hard, but they might actually take less salary. There was actually a thought at the time that employees would work for less money and salary to get a piece of the pie. That didn't necessarily work out to be that way. So in looking back to 1984, Parsons had just increased year-to-year earnings, or actually quarter-to-quarter earnings, for 46 consecutive quarters. We were a darling on Wall Street, and we were constantly increasing our dividend during that entire time. So they said the success led to a leveraged buyout in 84, and part of that was some stress with our shareholders in terms of what they wanted us to do. We had a large cash hoard at the time, many hundreds of millions of dollars, and there was also differences by our shareholders of where we should be working around the world and what kind of things we should be working on, and we thought, well, we knew what we should be working on a lot more than they knew what they should be working on. So hence, pretty rapidly, the company decided to just take the whole show private. And we became a 100% ESOP at the time, the largest 100% owned ESOP company in the US. I think today we're fourth or fifth, but we're the largest in our industry. And 100% ESOP is a little different than a lot of the other options you see out there. And you'll see some other things that we happen to do that being 100% ESOP allows you to do. So it's what we did is we went ESOP. It's a defined contribution plan. Every employee who is a member of ESOP, and there are employees who are not a member of ESOP. For instance, if you are represented by a union, like say our motor vehicle inspection teams are, or some of our construction teams are, by ERISA law, you cannot then participate in ESOP. You also, because of our SCorp status and a couple other things, cannot participate if you are not a US citizen. So that can be a challenge for a global company. It's entirely company funded. So in essence, as it started, we took out, or the ESOP got a loan from the banks, and then we then took a loan out from the ESOP. As employees retire, and we paid off the loans, that freed up stock for us to distribute to employees. So every employee just got shares as a percentage of their salary up to federally mandated limits. And those days, these limits today, I think, are roughly about $185,000. So if your salary is $185,000, whatever your percent participation is, it caps. And if your salary is above that, you don't get any more ESOP shares. So it's a program that's exceedingly fair to ranking file employees. You might argue maybe it's not incentivizing your high performers enough. ESOP assets are held in trust. So we only have one shareholder in Parsons Corporation, the ESOP trust. All the shares are in it, and those of us employees have beneficial interest in that shareholder's assets. And as I said here, we're the 5th largest wholly owned ESOP company in the United States. So becoming an SCorp. When the laws changed, we took advantage to become an S corporation. So now we have a very unique funding. We pay no federal income taxes as a company because we are basically a retirement fund. We work for a pension fund, and that pension fund is our own pension fund. And so when those distributions, and we actually then had to go and had a big claim with the US federal government when originally in 1984, we said ESOP is a cost to the company. The federal government said, no, ESOP is a profit distribution. And we went to court with the federal government and won. And so our ESOP costs are a cost that are allowable in our DCA audited overhead rates. And in the day, that also tended to work for state and local and oil companies too. Today, it's all market-based pricing in those other markets, but at least in the time, it's still fairly significant. However, because we're an ESOP and because we're an SCorp, we can't use stock in acquisitions. All of our acquisitions we make are cash-based acquisitions. And in the last 4.5 years, we've bought about $1 billion worth of companies as we reshaped our portfolio back into oil and gas, in the midstream size and technology. We've invested in a lot of technology. We own quite a few patents. And to really build out our cybersecurity, intelligence, and defense platform. It also means if we buy a company, I can't immediately give one of you, if you have a company, shares in our company in lieu of cash to really get you on board with where we're going. We're precluded from doing that. We have to come up with other ways, cash-based compensation, unique structuring of the deal, et cetera. What we also found is that even though our employees have ESOP shares, your salaries still have to be competitive in the marketplace. People don't take stock in lieu of salary, at least not in our business. Maybe at Google they do, but not at Parsons. There's a lot of regulatory changes that come up. ERISA law is something that we have to be very versant in. And obviously SOX. Since we are, in essence, run it as a publicly traded company, we are completely SOX compliant. I'm going to use this chart also to describe how certain other parts, kind of governance issues work. I mentioned we have a board, 10-member board of 9 outside directors and myself. We also have an ESOP trustee. And the ESOP trustee is responsible for representing the shareholders. So when we have our annual shareholders meeting, the ESOP trustee is there. They go and go out and proxy all of the shareholders and get their ideas. But ultimately, they can vote however they want to vote. They don't have to vote in accordance with shareholder wishes. They always have, but they don't have to. And then we have our stock is appraised annually, and it's done externally by the same company that's done it since 1984. And they do a 3-factored analysis. They look at precedent transactions in the market space. They look at discounted cash flow. And they look at industry multiples. And there's a basket of companies that we're compared to, and it's changed over time just because our markets, what we participate in changes, and because of things like the AECOM-URS merger have obviously changed. And they're all publicly traded companies with the exception of CH2M Hill, who has to report their financials, but they're not a publicly traded company. So they use them in the basket as well. And they established a stock price in... we usually get our audited financials around Valentine's Day, and then we will publish that year's stock price by the end of February, maybe the 1st of March. And then kind of an open season starts then in March for what's called shares that are, people left the company and they didn't have them vested, and those get turned back in. And then from that point on, that stock price is good for that through the end of November. And then we go silent and dark from December through the next open season. And for that entire period, regardless of whether our earnings are up or down or whatever, that stock price is known. So employees have a pretty good idea what their retirement savings plan is every year. But it does go up and down with the vagaries of the market. If the market multiples drop, our stock price will drop. Now, there are multiple ways of determining stock price, but being that we were a publicly traded company, we wanted a very transparent process that mimicked the outside market. That's not how all companies do it. So looking back after 30 years, it's really been great for attracting talent. It is part of our employee value proposition of why when you come to Parsons, you're going to be an owner of the company, and here's what that's done over 30 years. It's been really great for employee members. You'll see some numbers in a minute that we've made some very wealthy retirees through the years. The share buyback program has been great. We implemented a change a couple of years ago. Our stock price was climbing so rapidly, and we had so many folks retiring because of just the demographics of our team. We had a ton of stock floating into the company, and we were giving it all back. Now we were starting to really bump up to where we were exceeding federal mandates. So what was happening, we kept taking the stock at the top of the pool and putting it down into employees because you were getting up to the maximum number of shares you could get per year, which is not only predicated by your salary, it's also predicated by total number of dollars. So people at the very lowest end of our salary ranges were getting tremendous retirement benefits, some of them approaching 40, 50, 60% of their annual salary. We were giving them again as a retirement benefit. So it was, that was getting a little out of control. So when I became CEO, I immediately put an end to that. And we started buying back the excess shares. And because we had to be competitive with the market in terms of retirement plans. In terms of 20-year aggregate redemptions, so just over 20 years, we have paid out $1.8 billion to our employee shareholders who have retired. Most of those worked at our company 30 plus years, and we do see that we have less turnover. Once you get above maybe 10 years with a company, we don't have very much turnover at all. And we have 44.6 million shares we bought back, most of which we then gave back again so we can buy them back again the next go around. Because we're not publicly traded, we have the ability to test a lot of new markets. That's why I went through the little litany that I did. We are in a lot of things that most people wouldn't think that we're in. We all leverage the same engineering talent and the same project management talent, but we see areas where we think our talent can generate more profits for our shareholders doing something other than the core thing that we've done in the past. So we're very flexible and agile at starting and trying new markets and starting off with a way we make a low level of investment. And if we see it's going to work, then we put the pedal to the metal. If we think it's not going to work and we find out their driver is different than we thought, then we pull back and do something different. The ESOP share values increased 300% since we went public. Quarterly performance, I'm not up talking to shareholders and analysts every quarter. We do a lot of internal communications, but at least we're talking to folks that are knowledgeable in our industry and knowledgeable in our company. And I'm not spending, and my CFO and my general counsel aren't spending a lot of time with outside analysts and shareholders. So these have all been very much positives. The ESOP does have a big impact on culture, both positively and negatively. If you look at market research data, and we've looked at a lot of it through the years, most ESOP companies grow slower than other forms of management. Public companies tend to grow quite quick. Companies where you have one overwhelming shareholder, a founding shareholder, tend to grow quick as long as they have access to capital. ESOPs tend to become internally focused because people get the mindset, I am working for everybody else's retirement fund here, I can't take risk. And that's obviously the anathema to growth and profits and shareholder wealth creation. So as part of our culture, we have to do a lot of education. Yes, we have a very deep and strong fiduciary responsibility, but let's not forget the fact that our biggest fiduciary responsibility is to grow stock price, just like a publicly traded company. It definitely clarifies the benefit linkage to the success of the business. And we share our EBITDA and NOI and backlog and gross profit sold numbers with all our employees on a quarterly basis. And most of them are pretty articulate. Some of them aren't, but it's not because of lack of data. And it's also a great opportunity to build stock price to the underlying drivers of the stock price. Because again, if you're coming out of school and your degree is in science or engineering, you may not have the basic business understanding of what drives stock price, and I'll go into a minute what drives our stock price. But if it's not transparent, it's a formula for disaster. I'm not aware of class action lawsuits by ESOPs, but I do think it's a possibility if you ever left your employee base feeling like you were playing games with the stock price to support senior management or something else. So what drives our stock price? Ours is all on EBITDA and EBITDA growth, so earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. I know a lot of companies have EBITDA and in like bonuses. Bonuses are an expense, and we treat them just like any other expense. We don't take them out when it comes to our stock price performance. Cash flow also is a big driver. I was talking to the CEO of a very large contractor working in Saudi Arabia, and he was talking about how, with this reduction of oil prices, they haven't been paid for like 9 months, and it's going to be a very large amount of money, and they're having now line up banks to, it's not really factoring receivables, but it sure sounds like factoring receivables, but the rates are much better. Cash is king. We always say profit's an opinion, cash is fact. So we have a very cash-oriented culture in Parsons and in backlog growth. So when you look at the things that Houlihan Lokey comes up with our stock price and has for 32 years, those are the things that primarily drive their valuation of us. And so our employees are very empowered to help drive our overhead and cost of goods sold. So our employees are empowered and rewarded and remunerated for coming up with new technology and new ways to help us deliver our services with fewer man hours or less cost. I was at a meeting just before Thanksgiving and with Google, and Google brought in 10 companies that they've bought over the last 2 or 3 years, all on what they're calling the Internet of Mobile Things, IoMT. And Google is looking to disrupt transportation industry, the industry that we all know. And their argument is that if you look at any other industry out there, from maybe the sole exception of healthcare and pharmaceuticals, what we have today, like these little phones, and this is probably about 10 or 20 or 30 times the power of a Cray computer when, at least when I was starting my career, and those were, $50, $60, $70 million. And now this thing is, $300 or $400. So the productivity gains that technology is driven in most industries are astounding. Yet the data is pretty clear. When you look at the engineering, construction, infrastructure business, we are not productive. Our buildings cost more today than they did before. There was an estimate done recently on a U.S. missile system that said if you aggregated all the dollars that were spent building the U.S. strategic missile system, which is Minuteman, Midgetman, Peacekeeper, MX, Atlas, Nike, goes on, and put that in total dollars, the number would come out in 2015 dollars to be something on the order of $20 billion were spent building the missile system. If you were to go build it today, though, what would it cost? The number is like 1.2 trillion. It's because we're so much less productive. Now, we may not be the cause of all of that. You can argue there's environmental permitting you never had to do before. There's a lot of government regulation. There's been material cost increases. But what it does, it leaves the door open for disruptors. So in the case of surface transportation, one of the things Google is looking at is if you look at the data of what it costs for all the roads and bridges and track and rail and things like that around the US, it costs about $2.50 per mile traveled, I think is the number. Don't quote me exactly, but that's something like that. And Google would like to get that down to less than 10 cents per mile traveled. And they have a whole lot, driverless cars is clearly a part of it. There's a lot of other things that go into it. So disruption is going to be key. So how do you get your employees thinking disruptively? We spend a lot of time at that at Parsons, and I personally lead that. It's usually actually the part that I'm most fascinated. We have disrupted a lot of industries ourselves in the past. When we did outsourcing for telcos, we were the first company to come in and say, we'll take your costs for your facilities. We took one major regional Bell operating company and said, day one, looking at all the suppliers you're using and how you're getting work done, day one, I guarantee a 20% cost reduction on a design build basis. And I'll give you an additional 7% per year if you give me a 10-year contract. And we met and beat those numbers. So their facility costs just dropped dramatically. And it was all by looking at how could we deliver facilities a whole different way? How could we disintermediate the supply chain that was there, their managers who were thinking, I would say, kind of through yesterday's lens, based on what we saw in other markets and other parts of the world, how we could deliver things better, faster, cheaper. Capital efficiency is obviously big, and your employees are very important. Cog in the wheel in terms of how do they get their cash collections faster, how do we get our bills out quicker, how do we ask for change orders and get paid on those change orders. That's not all controlled by the people in this room. That's controlled by a lot of the people that work for us, and they have to be engaged, and that's what helps drive shareholder value. And then how do we grow backlog? Everyone's in sales, and growing backlog typically takes risk. And unless you're just in a hot market, which I remember those days. I haven't seen those for a while when it didn't matter what we did. We were just going to be growing 10, 12, 15% the following year. It's been a lot tougher since the financial crisis. So if you are considering an ESOP, and I'll open this up to questions, but nearing the end of my first part here, there are 7,000 ESOP plans in the United States today, covering 13.5 million employees. So there's a large body of knowledge in the consulting community, the legal community, the financial community on how to help with ESOPs. When we went ESOP, there was nothing. Now, it's still not the most common form of ownership, so it's still less knowledge than there is for other types of ownership, but there is a lot of talent out who can advise. Interestingly enough, since the turn of the century, and I'm talking about 2000, is that the number of plans has decreased in the United States. But the number of employees covered by the plans has increased. So plan size is getting larger. One of the unique things that ESOPs do allow for is relatively painless merger between ESOPs. And I don't know, I can't tell you if that's what's driving this, but it might very well be. So as David, I think, mentioned in his talk earlier, great time to sell or buy in our business. Mergers is another option, and merging ESOP plans is not an impossible thing to do, and it does, allows the same employees who are participating on both sides, as long as you agree on valuations, to continue now growing as part of the bigger entity. Non-U.S. employees can't participate, and that is an issue for us. We have too much of our employee base, and it's an issue I'm struggling with, and we're going to have to do something about that. Executive compensation. When I look at, in all of my employees, read the 10Ks and 10Qs of our publicly traded competitors, they see what they get in terms of stock grants and options, although those are becoming less popular. We can't give stock-based compensation. So what we do is basically proxy shares with cash. But it's cash. It's fighting for cash with everything else that you fight for cash with, M&A and other investments, and it's also a hit to earnings. But it's just, we haven't found another way around that. And in some emerging markets, stock is not always what people want. They would rather have more cash rather than get stock. And it is, at least for us in the past, it's been an expensive plan. Right now, it's not an expensive plan. It's market price, but it is more. It's not as competitive as no retirement plan, which I'm always amazed at how many people in America would rather have no retirement plan at all and increase cash. They're not my age. They tend to be younger. So that's my summary of Parsons and how we got to where we got and the kind of interesting things we do. One last thing I will mention to you, just in full disclosure, we have, ever since I became CEO, which was in fact, I became CEO 45 days before the price of oil hit $150 a barrel and 4 months before Lehman bankruptcy occurred. And we had a lot of cash in the bank. And I remember our treasurer coming to us, who'd just become treasurer, because I made the treasurer CFO, because I was CFO before I became CEO. She was literally crying, what do I do with our cash? If the whole world collapses, well, the whole world collapses, we've got bigger problems worrying about our cash. But it was an interesting time to become CEO. We are, unlike maybe many of you, if I heard Dave correctly, many of you are leading market indicators. Parsons is definitely a lagging market indicator. And I studied it when I was going to UCLA. We tend to lag the market by 2 or 3 years. So our best years in history were 2008, 2009, 2010. Record years, cash flow, profits, revenues, everything. 2011 is a disaster. 2012, we got back to 2011 numbers primarily by cutting a heck of a lot of overhead and getting our profits back up. And then we've been we've had parts that are growing. Our Middle East unit has been growing for quite strong. We've been hiring about 250 people a month for 18 months in the Middle East. That has slowed down dramatically. And when you look at that, ESOPs are really phenomenal when you first start. So from 1984 through about 2004, what we had was a fairly large employee base, and the people who were going to be retiring next year didn't have very many ESOP shares. So you were plowing money into, collecting money, if you will, for future retirements, much like an insurance company. But you didn't have the cash flow going out until you finally got to what's called a mature ESOP, where your people who are retiring have now been their whole career with you, collecting ESOP shares for their entire career, and now they're going out. So our annual cost of our ESOP program these days is between 150 and 200 million a year. And that's money I could spend doing other things with the company. And if we were public, ESOP would be our largest shareholder, which is what we were when in 1984. Our largest shareholder was our employees. It wasn't an ESOP, but it was our employee stock ownership plan, which gave us a lot of freedom. But then those shares would be traded to the public. And so the cash would be coming from other share buyers. And what we would see is that our ownership would go down over time. Now, we've not made a decision to do that, but we are constantly looking at what our options are in terms of capital structure. But for 30 years, it's been a great ride. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Okay, I have one, Chuck, and we'll come right up to the front in a minute. My first question is, you've talked about a 100% ESOP. Comment a little on the pros and the cons as to why you went 100% versus partial. And the reason for that comment is that in our observation of the marketplace, everybody in the room, probably 90% of the firms in the AE space are partial ESOPs, not 100%.
So what we've seen with partial ESOPs, and maybe many of you experience this, is that if you have other shareholders who are partners alongside your ESOP, and your percent of the profits accumulate to you. So you've got a tax bill at the end of the year. Typically what those companies do is then dividend out money to pay for the taxes so you don't have a negative cash flow situation. You never accumulate any cash as a company in that model. That's our perception. So you'll see in us, we'll build up $400, $500, $600 million in cash, go out and do some acquisitions. That is a freedom that's allowed to us as a 100% ESOP versus a partial ESOP.
Okay, very good. Next question.
I've got two questions. The first one is a simple yes, no. Do you pay dividends?
Not anymore.
Okay, so now I'll make it more complicated. Why not? Is that because you're paying $150 to $200 million out?
Yeah, well, what happened in 1984, in order to do the ESOP, we were highly leveraged. And so at the time, we didn't think we had the cash flow to pay those dividends. As we started paying down the debt and it freed it up, then we were in some markets, we could really use that to reshape our company in terms of investments, and we think that'll lead to more higher shareholder return than paying a dividend. And that's always been our perception then. It's always on the plate. Do we buy? Right now we're buying back shares versus paying dividends.
The second question is, one of the things with an ESOP is effectively no employees have any skin in the game. Okay, I come to work, I get my salary, I hope the value goes up and I get something for it, but they have no skin in the game. Our company 15, 20 years ago had an ESOP, got rid of it, and the CEO went around, handed checks to people, their closeout on the ESOP, and some people said, "What is this for?" They didn't know they were owners. You want to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, that would sound to me like not a very good shareholder communication plan. That is so much a part of our culture. I mean, everybody wants to see what the stock price is, and I think that's why I said early on that there has to be this transparency. People have to understand it's a big deal when your stock price comes out. They need to understand how the stock price was calculated, what were the drivers for that stock price, et cetera. So we've never had that issue. I want to go back to that dividend issue too. There's also another issue with dividend. Again, with an ESOP, it's a very tax-efficient structure. So all of your retirement savings are going into the ESOP, and then when you retire, what most people do is flip that into an IRA. So again, they only pay taxes now when they're in a much lower income bracket and take that out over time. If you're paying that out as dividends, that's taxable income for those employees at the time. My argument would be there's probably other ways of dealing with the cash flow issue. Maybe it's increased salaries, something other than paying a dividend, but that's just my opinion.
We are a partial ESOP, as Frank had mentioned. As I know this was a long time ago when you transitioned to a 100% ESOP and an SCorp, but do you recall what some of the challenges were when you moved? I assume you were a C-Corp before that, is that a
Yeah, we were a publicly
assumption?
traded C-Corp, and the first thing we did is we went to an ESOP. So we were a 100% ESOP C-Corp. And then
So what challenges did you have there? Were there any initial challenges of people selling all of their stock to go ESOP?
No. So how that went is our shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We offered a 35% premium over our then trading stock price, bought all the shares in from all the institutional and other shareholders there were, and then put those in the trust, and then they were again divvied out each year based on the repayment of the loan to the ESOP and then given out to the employees. I don't believe the SCorp status either existed or didn't exist in a way that we were allowed to use it at the time. When that did come into play, the other challenge we had is we had a huge built-in gain. We owned our campus in Pasadena, and we had a huge built-in gain on that. And so I think for 10 years? For 10 years, we had to not transact anything with that structure or pay the taxes on that big. Once that escaped, then we don't really have anything left as an issue. It is a complicated structure for others to understand. I will say that. By others, I mean other companies that don't have ESOPs.
Okay, coming right over here.
I'm curious, what is the estimated tax savings relative to your repurchase liability on an annual basis?
Savings compared to?
Well, because you're 100% SCorp, ESOP, and
yeah, so at average, I'd say these days we figured it's running about $90 million a year is our savings. And so for the 20 years, that stayed that percentage, and our earnings have come up, so you can take that down over time. we were saving much, much more than we were paying out. That $90 million today is now eclipsed by the amount of cash we have going out the door to shareholders who are retiring.
I've got another question for you, Chuck. The foreign employees, you've got a whole bunch of people in the Middle East and other places. When you take U.S.-based ESOP employees and move them to the Middle East, and they're in the mix of the people that are being compensated and rewarded in a different way, what are the challenges you face with that? And then what happens when they come back?
So most of our ESOP employees, not all, I mean, there are different situations in different countries, generally leave the U.S. payroll and go on the payroll of that country. So their ESOP is frozen while they're out. We then give them a cash payment to offset the loss of the ESOP shares while they're out.
Is that what the other employees in the foreign countries are getting? So it's similar.
Yes, and generally in the foreign countries, there's some sort of cash-based retirement plan. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Now you have another segment to go here, right?
No.
You have no others. All right. Thought you had mentioned that was the first part. Any other questions? Yes, come right back here.
Curious with your other benefits that wrap around the ESOP. Do you have another retirement plan, other forms of benefits? How do you balance those with your ESOP?
So that's a constant analysis. We get a lot of outside consulting on the plans. We survey our employees. You know, because our ESOP was predated the diversification rights, our whatever year it is, you might know, we don't have to diversify our shares. So these days, you start an ESOP, you know, employee get diversification rights. They can say, I don't want all my money tied up in your shares. I want to have a 401k or something else too. So very few of our shares, only those since we've been buying back shares and in giving those back, only those shares have diversification rights, and almost no one's asked for diversification. So that's issue one. Issue two, we've always also had a 401k. And that's a 401k that to participate, you put in and then we match, you know, 50 cents on the dollar, generally speaking. But then we have a lot of special purpose employment vehicles for certain markets where an ESOP is just not going to be the right retirement plan because, you know, we're coming in, we're doing a program, it's only going to last 5 years or less. Employees will never get the vesting in place. So we will custom produce plans for those markets and those companies. For the basic Parsons employee, you know, it's all the standard healthcare benefit, life insurance. We have a pretty rich plan. We've always viewed our benefit plan as being a part of our employee value proposition and competitive advantage. But from a retirement perspective, every employee who gets ESOP also has access to a 401k.
Thanks, Frank. This question may follow up on what you were talking about there, but with the changing demographics of the marketplace, as you see more millennials coming into the market space, are there similar changes in the desired mechanisms for retirement, or even the discussion about where does a retirement package play in their mind? More cash versus, I'm thinking, down the road.
Yeah, I think we do see, especially in certain submarkets, things like cybersecurity. There's not a lot of resonance there with a stock ownership. They all get a stock ownership plan. They want to have their own company and become a unicorn. That they get. But being part of a plan where you build up assets over 30 years, I don't know if many of you have seen the demographics of students who graduate from college today. By the time they reach 35, on average, it said, they will have worked for more than 10 companies, and I think the average was 13. We're not yet seeing that, but we're seeing it start. So what value is an ESOP plan to somebody like that? Almost zero. So it's going to be an issue, I think.
Let me shift it a little to the merger and acquisition business. You mentioned that by going to the ESOP, all your acquisitions became cash-based acquisitions. Did that make it easier for you as a buyer or harder for you? Because what we observe in the marketplace, an awful lot of buyers entering the acquisition business want to use their shares and their share value for acquisitions.
Correct, yeah. I think it's probably made it more difficult, especially if you're a company with a lot of confidence in your market and where you're going to be over the next 3 to 4 years and you're on a great growth trajectory. You want to participate in the upside that you think your now combined entity is going to get from combining. And you can't do that if you can't be given shares. Like I said, we have to come up with other cash-based incentives to try to mimic that. It also would be much healthier on our cash position if we didn't have to use all cash to make acquisitions, although equity is a very expensive tool to make acquisitions with.
Okay. Is there a difference between the U.S.-based and the foreign-based in that regard? Are you using any of your external companies' shares to make external acquisitions?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Time for 1 or 2 more questions. Any others out here? Yes.
Charles, I want to ask a very different question. Halfway through, you talked about disruptive innovation and that you personally are passionate and help drive that. And it was actually announced about 20 years ago. I think Clayton Christensen came out with the concept and the true meaning of disruptive innovation, targeting underserved markets. And it's morphed in a lot of different. What does the disruptive innovation mean to Parsons and to you?
Well, that's a great question and one I'm passionate about. So there's 2 or 3 that we've done in my career. As an example, years ago, we decided to invest money to own what was called a piece of the Klaus sulfur removal process for heavy oil. And if you had, in those days, especially in the Middle East, a lot of the oil that was coming out wasn't light sweet crude. It was very much heavy sour crude. So we figured out and developed on our own nickel a patented technology with Klaus and augmented it with we had a gentleman named Dave Bevan who was great at rotating equipment, came up with another process we patented called the Bevan process, put those together and created a sulfur removal module that cost about $70 million. And that $70 million module would take heavy sour crude and produce light sweet crude at efficiencies that were orders of magnitude better than anything in the market. That was only half of the brilliance. The real brilliance was going around and saying, we then patented it, hired attorneys around the world, and had them on watch to protect it, notified every national oil company and every large oil company that this existed with marketing with the follow-up, and if you even think of using it without our approval, you're going to be seeing these lawyers in court. And by the way, if you want it, the only way that you're going to get that process is to give us the entire refinery, which will do cost reimbursable at a 4.5 multiplier. Design plus field labor construction. We made tremendous money. We had so many, it was creating tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of profit for the oil companies and the national oil companies. We had so many customers in line. We literally, if you think of it, it's like going to the meat counter, we couldn't hire engineers fast enough. We were taking tickets, telling people, go get in the end of the line. If you complain, we'll take the ticket back and you can go farther back in the line. We literally couldn't keep up. So that was a great era for us. And what we saw is that there's 2 kinds of innovation. There was technology innovation and there's business model innovation. So fast forward to the story I told about the chemical demilitarization. We had been awarded the work from the Army to develop the ability to incinerate chemical waste. And then that went away. So we were looking at a market that we felt we were best positioned to own, went away. But we had done some work on municipal wastewater with supercritical water oxidation. Actually, it kind of failed. We had a water plant where the pipes turned white hot and basically melted. The process ran away from us because for any of you who do wastewater, you know the reason why probably. You don't really know what's in the waste stream. But with a chemical plant, you do. So we took that process knowledge, redirected it into chemical demilitarization, and produced and patented the process, then went and bought a facility from Department of Energy and patented all the equipment that went with it. So when the government had this, we said, you can pick whoever you want to do these jobs. I think if you pick us, we're going to design it, build it, own it, a whole thing. But if you don't pick us, you're not using our technology unless we're selected to design it and we're producing all of the equipment for it. And so even when the work came out here recently with the chemical warheads or the chemical munitions in Libya and Syria, it was Parsons people out on those ships at sea neutralizing those wastes hand in glove with the U.S. military. That's another example. And then, like I said, the third, we really brought in a disintermediation model to not only the wireless industry, but also the wireline industry. We noticed the Telecom Act of 1996 had a huge impact on telcos. What it did is it forced telcos to go from profit-based regulation, they got 8 or 10% profit, to a price-based regulation. So they charge the consumer so many cents per minute. Well, we looked at that and said, holy cow, we don't do telecom, but we get it. If they can lower their costs, telcos are making a lot more money. So we went unsolicited proposals to telcos at the time saying, if you'll give us your entire outside plant, like 50 million square feet of buildings, and we know you're spending $400 million a year, we're going to drop that to $300 million a year, and that other $100 million is going to go right to your shareholders. And then we went in and outsourced all their outside plant engineers. So we walked over 3,000 employees onto our payroll and re-engineered the way they delivered the cable side. We did the same thing on the wireless side with Ericsson. We went and walked over all of their installers and their engineers and did the same process in wireless. So what I'm always trying to get our employees to do is, the old phrase, think out of the box. I mean, get way out of the box. Let's not figure out how we do this bridge the same old way. So that's what we love about P3s, is that our engineers are now free to take whatever anybody else had given as a concept and do it a whole new way. We hire people, we have on roll people like former rock stars, literally. People like from Steely Dan and Doobie Brothers, because they're just so creative and out-of-the-box thinking. And we bring them in for meetings on a semi-annual basis. We have one of them working almost full-time with our defense crew, and they just see the world so differently. And then that's what really inspires our people to come up with these ideas.
Chuck, I'm going to follow up on this a little bit. One of the things you mentioned was, going into disruptive business models.
Mm-hmm.
PPP is a disruptive kind of an approach to engineering. Having sat on a board of a ESOP company, 4,000-person engineering firm, I can tell you, I want to take it back to your decision to go PPP and the risk decision and discussion at the board level. Because we had some of those decisions, and with an ESOP, taking risk was something that ESOP didn't want to do, the engineers didn't want to do, but you've overcome that, and you're in that. How did you have that discussion?
Well, one, it goes back to our roots. We have a very risk management culture. I remember when I became CFO, and we have lost a lot of money through the years too on big jobs. I mean, we had a thing called a dirty dozen for a while when the price of oil was 8. We had 8 projects that lost a lot of money. But what we found with that risk culture is we probably had 12 more that made so much more money, they totally compensated for those 12 that went poorly. And as long as we were operating in different markets, and moving forward and leaning into the wind, it was always best for our shareholders. So back before we became ESOP, we viewed ourselves as an EPC company. We loved CM at risk. We made the decision to move into design build for infrastructure as a joint venture partner on equity large projects in 1995. Our first job was the T-Rex project in Denver. We were joint ventured with a large contractor. So it was a natural progression. What we saw with the large projects, with the global financial crisis, the pressures it put on it, and I went and met with ministers in Canada to understand why P3 made sense. Because on surface, P3 makes no sense. A large municipality or government should be able to borrow money cheaper than we can, plus they don't have to pay us the premium on our equity. What I was told repeatedly in Canada, and they were the most articulate explaining it, was that the supply chain becomes so much more efficient. And you get all these stakeholders out of the way who slow down process and keep kind of gilding the lily and putting more scope growth in. You now have a responsibility. They said their biggest concern was they love design build, but their concern was design builders would give them a bad product. So let's stick the design builder with 30 years of operations. Now their biggest concern is, do you have the financial stability to be there for 30 years? So when we saw that model and we saw how efficient it was in terms of delivering physical infrastructure, in terms of time and cost, our feeling was it'll never go back. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back in the box again, because how are you going to go back to your ratepayers and say, you know, P3s aren't really the way to go. We're going to have to raise your rates because we're going to go back to design, bid, build, and it's more expensive. I'm not saying it's true for every project, but for the really big ones, when you look at even things like, it's not very popular, but California High-Speed Rail, and our first winning bid on that was $150 million below their estimate. You can be so creative in those kinds of opportunities.
But it's still not very popular in the United States. You're still running into a lot of
Right.
opposition.
Yeah, I think more on the client side, not wanting to change and be with it. We just see it as an unstoppable force, and it's going to be a lot more popular outside the U.S. for a while than it is in the U.S.
Thank you, Chuck. Unbelievable presentation.
Very good.
Fantastic.
Yeah.